Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate, and also, make fun. I live in Boulder, one of the most expensive places in the Front Range to live. Why? Well, the housing prices are so affordable. To talk to me about that and so many other things, Randal O'Toole from the Cato Institute, and Independence many years ago. Good to have you.
Glad to be here again.
And I know this isn't your thing, but I just want to say, you worked for Independence Institute back in 2004 when you did the predictions on what fast tracks would do, and you made these ridiculous proposals. You said if this thing actually passes, they're going to be woefully underfunded and go wildly over budget, and it will not be done on time. It will not be done on schedule, and it took, I think, a whole 2, maybe 3 weeks for those predictions to come true.
Absolutely. The cost has gone way up, and they're now saying instead of getting done by 2017, what's it going to be, 2031 or something like that?
If it ever.
If ever, yeah.
But what I love is it's really Colorado's big dig in that they got us a little pregnant on it, and now they're going to try to come back and do it over and over and over again.
And what about the audacity of RTD saying, okay, we're going to use BNSF's line to Boulder and Longmont to run our trains on, and never asking BNSF how much it would cost, and then after the election, it's going to cost, we assumed it was going to cost $50 million, and it's going to cost $550 million to rent it from BNSF? Why didn't they ask before the election?
One of the things that I found the most entertaining in their proposal was they had their projections of revenue based on the Denver economy growing at 6% each and every year for 30 years without a single downturn. Now, even I know that wasn't going to happen. But when I asked, well, who'd you run this by? They said, well, the Denver Chamber of Commerce. They said it was reasonable.
Well, if you looked at it, you could see that they had such small reserves that if there was a downturn in any year between about 2008 and 2015, they were going to go bankrupt. It was going to create huge problems. They'd have to essentially terminate bus service in a lot of places to be able to just keep their heads above water.
What always amazes me about the transit monopoly, the transit religion, is that it brings together some odd coalitions. You have the downtown Denver Chamber, the guys who are there making wheels, wheeling and dealing. You got bond dealers and suppliers and the guys who do the contracting. You've got the developers. You have all the suits and ties. But the soldiers, the foot soldiers in the fight, are the Birkenstock-wearing greenies who hate automobiles. So you have these two different groups coming together to make sure that money doesn't go to roads. It goes to rail.
Well, that's actually a very common thing. You have the people who make money hanging around in the background, and then they put some other moralistic front group up in front to make it sound like, this is environmentally sound, or this is more moral than anything else, and so people have to vote for it, not realizing that what they're really voting for is enriching the handful of people in the background.
Let's talk about some of the people in the background. There are a lot of developers who love rail projects. I mean, when you look at it, not all of them, but some of them who happen to be on the rail line. They seem to think that the money is going to come because having property on that rail line around those stations, the property values are going to go skyrocketing. Everyone's going to want to move there, and they're going to make a lot of money.
Well, developers like to build. They like to build something that they can make some money from, but they really just like to build. And what's happened is urban planners in Denver and Portland and other cities have come up with this utopian idea that Americans would rather live in 5-story apartment buildings with the ground floors of shops so they can go downstairs and go shopping on a light rail line so they can take the light rail to work than live in single-family homes. And so developers, since that's what planners want, developers will build that. However, they know there isn't really much of a market for it. So the developers hold out and insist on getting all kinds of subsidies using what's called tax increment financing. And so hundreds of millions of dollars of property taxes that you think are going to schools and fire and other urban services are actually going into the pockets of developers to subsidize the kind of utopian communities that planners want and that a few people like to live in, but most people don't.
And so you see a couple different things happening. You have tax increment financing, which is a way to rob people and give it to developers. But also, you've got these urban growth boundaries, these other devices to keep people penned in. I want to talk to you a little bit about suburbia. I was raised in suburbia. Suburbia gets this bad, awful rap. Why is it that people don't like suburbia? I look at Denver Metro, and it's mostly suburbs. When you look at the population density, the city center is no longer the population center. It's spread out over these counties. People don't work in the city center. People are working in these communities, yet we build everything for the city center. Why do we love the burbs and hate the burbs at the same time?
Well, it's really an issue of class.
I'm a classy guy. I like the burbs.
If you look at the history of suburbanization in the United States, it started in the 1830s when wealthy people realized they could take steam trains that were just being developed in the 1830s and move out of town and then take the train to commute to work. So you got wealthy people moving into these new suburbs, building beautiful mansions that today we call these big Victorian houses, and we love to save and put on historic registers. Then in the 1890s came the streetcar. The streetcar was too expensive for working class people to ride, but middle class people could ride it. So middle class people started moving out to the suburbs, and they built bungalows and four-square houses and other nice houses in the suburbs. And nobody complained about the suburbs. Nobody complained about urban sprawl when it was wealthy and middle class people moving out. After World War II, however, United States incomes, thanks to various factors among working class people, grew so rapidly that they were able to move out to the suburbs. They were able to buy cars and buy land cheap and build a house. But the houses they were building did not meet the approval of the middle class and wealthy people who were already out there. They didn't use the same architectural styles that were the right styles. And they had different cultural tastes. They drank different beverages. They ate different foods. They listened to different music.
You're talking about my hometown again. You're talking about Boulder, that there's certain styles that they like.
That's right.
Talk to me a little bit about the car, too. Without the invention of cheap transportation,
that's right,
the burbs would have stayed for the wealthy.
It was not the car, it was the mass-produced car. We had cars invented in 1890 and only the wealthy could afford them. But then in 1913, Henry Ford developed the moving assembly line for building Model Ts. And he was able to double the pay he paid workers and cut the price of his cars in half. So suddenly workers could afford to buy cars. They could afford to drive out to where land was cheap, build a house there, and still commute to work. And actually, the jobs rapidly moved to the suburbs too, because the kind of factories that you could use moving assembly lines in required lots of land, and land was cheap in the suburbs. So the factories moved to the suburbs, the workers moved to the suburbs, and this is what raised the ire of the middle class.
Now, we think of downtown. I mean, Denver, we have a downtown that's largely offices, all right? It's clean. But when we think of downtown, it has this image of being chic and upscale, people in lofts. That wasn't the case when suburbanization was going on. Downtown, where the shops were, it's not a pretty place to live.
Well, we have this image that cities have to have a downtown, but cities only really had downtowns when if they were built between about 1820 and 1920, because that's when, in 1820, that's when the factory system was developed, and you started getting concentrations of jobs in one place, and so people lived near those concentrations of jobs. 1920 is when the automobile became popular and factories started moving to the suburbs, so you didn't need downtowns anymore. So no downtowns before 1820, no downtowns after 1920, except urban planners and elected officials think our city has to have a downtown to be a real city. Otherwise, it's not a real city. So they start throwing money to subsidize downtown. You had older cities like Denver, whose downtowns kind of declined because the offices and the factories and the houses all moved out into the suburbs. You had new cities like San Jose and Phoenix and Houston that didn't even have downtowns because they didn't need them anymore. And so the cities threw money at subsidizing to build downtowns. You wouldn't have a downtown in Houston if they hadn't subsidized it. You really don't have a downtown in Phoenix at all. So to reverse that decline, Denver has thrown hundreds of millions of dollars in tax dollars to the downtown area to make it chic to live in, but really it's not the way most people want to live.
Talk to me a little bit about home prices, because I see around the country we're in this terrible slump. We have overbuilt. The bubble has burst. People are having their homes foreclosed upon, and people are just walking away. There's some people just leave the keys in the door and literally walk away. What caused this? There are those who say we have too much housing.
Well, in 2005, somebody asked Alan Greenspan if there was a housing bubble. He said, no, there's no national housing bubble. There's some local bubbles, but there's no national one. And people laughed because the people thought there is a national housing bubble. They could see the prices going up and they figured it was a national bubble. But today we can look back on it and see he was right. There was no national housing bubble. If you go to North Carolina or Georgia or Texas, there was no bubble at all in those states. The bubbles were in states that have strict land use regulation. They're in metropolitan areas that have drawn urban growth boundaries and caused housing prices to go up. When you restrict the supply of housing, a small change in demand leads to a large change in price. So if demand goes up a little bit, prices go way up. If demand goes down a little bit, prices crash. If you don't restrict housing, then changes in demand have no influence on price. So we can look at a graph of housing prices in places that have restricted housing with urban growth boundaries and so on, and they went like this. You can look at a graph of housing prices in places like Houston or Dallas or Atlanta or Raleigh, North Carolina, and they went like this. Hardly an increase, hardly a decrease.
Well,
if we didn't have those restrictions in covering half of America's housing, we wouldn't have had a bubble, and we wouldn't have had a housing crisis.
It's a large statement to make. Let me kick it back to you and make sure I understand it. The crisis that we're in now, still, and the bubble that came in that really started it all was this housing bubble. I've always thought it was easy access to loans, to giving government-backed loans to people who did not deserve to have a backed loan, so didn't have the credit history to do it. And when the government started to say, instead of giving loans to people based on their ability to pay it back, we'll give it based on something else, as if it was the government's business to begin with, I thought that caused the bubble. You're telling me that really what it was cities like Denver. We have an organization called Dr. Cog, which is a metropolitan planning organization, saying this is how you grow. You will grow in here. In Boulder, which says you can only grow in here. Therefore, prices went skyrocketing, went up too high, and when demand started going down, the market fell apart.
That's exactly what happened. And people have blamed the bubble on the Community Reinvestment Act, or low interest rates on the part of the Federal Reserve, or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac buying mortgages that had zero down payments and liar's loans, or they blamed it on the subprime lenders. The thing is, all of these factors are national. They played just as strongly in Houston as they did in Denver. They played just as strongly in Raleigh as they did in Colorado Springs or Boulder. But what wasn't in common was this land use regulation. Where you had land use regulation, almost everywhere you had bubbles. Where you didn't have land use regulation, almost everywhere you didn't have bubbles. And it's not just in the United States. You can look at Canada. Vancouver has strict land use regulation, big bubble. Winnipeg and Calgary and Edmonton, no land use regulation, no bubbles. You look at Australia, land use regulation, bubbles. You look at Japan. They didn't have regulation. They had a tax policy where if you own rural land and you improved it and you made some money on a capital investment, you were taxed 150% of your profits on the capital investment. That's pretty sufficient to discourage rural development. So they had a big housing bubble that led to their financial crisis in 1990.
What does a house cost? I mean, it depends. Boulder right now, you cannot live in anything under $400,000. People don't make that much money. What does a home cost? What should it cost? What does it historically cost?
Historically, homes have been worth about the median home in any community in the country was worth about twice median family incomes.
So if somebody was making $50,000 a year,
you'd buy a $100,000 house. And you could afford it. And there'd be houses for everybody in the community. The people who made 25 grand a year could buy a $50,000 house. People who made 10 grand a year could buy a $20,000 house.
So you're not talking about some sort of regulation. This was just
this is just the way it worked.
The marketplace.
That's the way it worked, yeah. And wealthier cities had bigger houses than less wealthy cities.
But people there made more money.
Yeah, people there made more money. But when we started doing this regulation, which was in the late 60s in California and Hawaii, in the 70s in Oregon, and in the 80s in Washington and Florida and other states, then those ratios changed and suddenly prices started going up. In cities without regulation, it cost about $50 a square foot to build a house. In Oregon and in Denver, it cost about $150 a square foot to build a house. In California, it costs $300 a square foot to build a house. And these costs include things like the permitting costs, which is much more onerous in states with a lot of regulation. The land cost is a lot higher. Labor costs are higher because labor has to buy housing too. And generally there's other costs as well in states with a lot of land use regulation. And so I can show you on the market today houses in Houston, 5-bedroom, 3-bath houses for $90,000. 2-bedroom, 2-bath houses for less than $60,000.
People say, but that's Houston. That's because nobody wants to live in Houston, therefore there's no demand.
And guess where what the fastest growing metropolitan area in America is? Houston. Houston is growing by more than the population of Boulder every year.
Houston is growing. They add another Boulder, another 100,000 people a year to Houston.
In the Houston metropolitan area.
And still housing prices
have not gone up, have flat.
Why?
Because there's no limit on supply. Counties around Houston are not allowed to zone. Texas did not give the counties the authority to zone. So even if Houston had a lot of regulation, which it doesn't, Houston doesn't have any zoning, but even if it did have a lot of regulation, developers could just walk across the line and put anything they want in, and they will build what the market wants. And then there's no zoning, and they can sell it, and it's cheap. So developers have tens of thousands of acres of land already with the infrastructure installed that they've paid for, and then they can sell a lot to you. You can buy a lot, get the permits to build on it, build and move in within 4 months, within 120 days of the day you buy that lot. That means when demand goes up, developers just sell more lots. When demand goes down, they sell fewer lots. And the price doesn't change.
So in Houston, and is Houston an anomaly? If, for instance, Denver got rid of DRCOG, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, or if DRCOG itself said, we're wiping away all zoning regulations, would our housing prices plummet?
I think they wouldn't increase any more than they are now. They might go down a little bit, but the main thing is they wouldn't increase with the next boom. So if you own a house and you expect to double your money in the next boom, it's not going to happen.
You told me something kind of interesting, that when the rich came out to the burbs, that was nice. There was nobody there to complain. When the middle class came out to the burbs, there wasn't that many of them. Nobody complained. But when the poor folks could afford the car and go out to the burbs, we don't want those type in the neighborhood. And it was, you said it had something to do with culture when we were talking. It's funny that back then, poor people would have chickens in their backyard and livestock so that they could have milk and eggs and the occasional chicken for dinner. The folks here and the burbs didn't want that, so they put in zoning laws to stop it. And now, so many years later, we're reversing some of those laws because now the yuppies who have a lot of money want to have chickens for the organic eggs.
Yes, and it's not just chickens in the backyard. Zoning originally was intended to keep working class people out of neighborhoods, and so working class people took in boarders. So zoning typically restricted people from taking in boarders. You could only have one family in a house. Working class people had in-home businesses, so early zoning forbade in-home businesses because middle class people worked downtown or wherever. They didn't work in their homes. Nowadays, we're changing all that. We're allowing in-home businesses. We're practically mandating people to have accessory units attached to their houses so that they can have supposedly granny flats for their aging parents to live in, but actually they just rent them out to other people. And This results in more density, this results in more traffic, this results in more congestion, but the planners think it's great because it's the way they think people ought to live, even though the planners themselves probably live on quarter-acre lots in single-family homes.
So right now, the price of a house up in Boulder, you can't get into anything for less than $400. As far as a unit of somebody's salary, what is the worst place to live? In other words, if it used to be that you take whatever you earn and you could afford a house that's twice that. So, I mean, if somebody who makes a decent wage of 50 grand a year, they can't touch anything in Boulder. They can, however, in Colorado Springs. What are the cities that are the best? What are the worst?
Well, Colorado Springs isn't bad. Boulder, right now, the median price of a home is almost 5 times the median income of families there. But it's not because, it's not 5 times because people has attracted wealthy people. It's 5 times because the poorest people have been pushed out to other places like Longmont and so on and so forth. You go to California, where these rules have been covered for not just one little town, but for huge metropolitan areas, the housing prices are 10 and 12 times median family incomes.
12 times?
12 times. That means if you paid half your salary on a mortgage, you'd have to pay for it forever and you'd never be able to pay it off.
Never.
Never.
Isn't that the way this started, where all you do is pay interest and pay interest and pay interest and pay interest and hope that market conditions when you retire make the house that you purchased be worth a whole lot more. You'll never get equity just by paying off the loan. You get equity because home prices go up, which means you want zoning laws as well. I've got to say, as a guy who bought a property in Boulder back in 1992, I'm the beneficiary of zoning. That is, the housing prices have gone up. I look better on paper now because nobody wants those people in Boulder.
Except when you don't have regulation, housing prices go up slowly, but they tend to go up or flat. They don't crash. When you have regulation, housing prices go up rapidly and then they crash. California has had 3 housing bubbles since they started imposing this regulation in the late 1960s. So if you think you're getting wealthy because of your house, that all depends on when you decide to sell the house. Are you lucky enough to decide to sell it at the peak of the bubble, or are you going to decide to sell it the day after the peak, in which case you lose hundreds of thousands of dollars because nobody's going to buy it unless you drop the price by a tremendous amount.
I keep hearing that government should make it a priority to help poor people become homeowners. As somebody who believes in limited government, as somebody who believes in ownership, I love the idea of people owning homes. When you own your home, something happens to you. You start taking pride in your home, and you realize that your financial future depends on this, your greatest asset, your home. So you're going to take care of it. You care about your neighbor's house because that affects your home value. So is home ownership something government should encourage? And if so, why is it that we want poor people to have homes, yet we zone them out of anything they can afford?
I think homeownership is something that government should encourage, but it should encourage it by getting out of the way. You look around the world, 25 years ago, the United States had some of the highest homeownership rates in the world because everybody else was so much lower. Today, we're right in the middle. There's a lot of countries in the world where the countries don't have mortgage interest deductions, they don't have Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's, they don't have FHA subsidized low interest loans, and yet they have much higher home ownership rates because government has gotten out of the way. They don't have the land use regulation, they don't have all the urban growth boundaries and the other obstacles to home ownership. So Brazil, where per capita incomes are 1/4 of ours, has 10% higher home ownership rates than we do, 75% as opposed to 65%.
Brazil has more homeowners.
Right.
As a percentage.
Yeah, Mexico has a higher home ownership rate than the United States.
Be. There's no way Mexico has a higher home ownership rate.
It does. Greece.
Why?
Italy, because government got out of the way, because they didn't have a war on sprawl, because they didn't draw urban growth boundaries and drive up housing prices.
Is your point that this war on sprawl, because nobody the word sprawl, you think of just these ugly homes that have been popped up all over the place, and one man's ugly home is another man's castle. But this war on sprawl has caused economic hardship, not just for the people who own the homes, but an economic collapse.
It has. If you go back in history, in the late 19th century, in American cities, working class people had higher home ownership rates than middle class people because they really valued owning a home because they could make money from it. They could take in boarders or have backyard livestock or whatever. And there were home builders that were building homes for the working class and selling them for $500. And they would sell them with 10 or 20% down, low down payments. They would carry your contract for you. And there were home builders in Chicago who built tens of thousands of homes and were proud of the fact that they never foreclosed on anyone. Instead, they encouraged people to buy up. They would buy a home for $500. Maybe they'd make some improvements to the home, then they'd sell it and buy a home for $1,000. And it was getting people into home ownership who had low incomes. Now you can't do that anymore. Home builders can't sell homes, build homes that are affordable to low income people. And it used to be that used homes tended to be a little more affordable, but now the people who own used homes see that, oh gee, a new house now costs $500,000, so I'm going to up the price of my house when I sell it, and they're not affordable either.
What is it we do? I mean, what change do you want to see?
Well, Florida has repealed its growth management law. California has repealed its tax increment finance law. We need to have places like Denver say, Dr. Cog, we don't want you to have urban growth boundaries anymore. These are the things we need to do, is get rid of these restrictive laws.
Let poor people become homeowners. The only way to do that is get rid of zoning.
And have government get out of the way.
All right, all in the book, American Nightmare from Cato Institute. Go to cato.org. You can also go to Amazon, and it has no pictures in it, so I have very little interest. But thank you very much. This is good stuff. It's great having you back in town.
Thank you.
I hope RTD learns their lesson. Listen to him next time. Listen to me on KHOW on Sunday evenings. Check out the Independence Institute. That's independenceinstitute.org. Tell a friend, and we'll see you next week.